Hi students, welcome back to this channel English Literature with Idham. I'm back with another fascinating topic, and that is the modern literature. And in this video, I would be dealing with some of the most important uh, areas and themes in the modern literature. And I would show that how these themes are represented in different dynamic literary pieces and how these themes are directly connected with the modern human issues. So, modern literature is not just about the storytelling, it is deeply connected with our literary theory, the cultural studies, political philosophy, psychoanalysis, feminism, post colonialism, Marxism, and eco criticism. So, these all theories and areas are directly or indirectly discussed in the modern literature. And without wasting our time, let us begin. So, the first classical and most important theme of the modern literature is identity crisis and the alienation. Remember that the modern literature has the predominant theme, and that is the identity, the quest for identity, and to struggle the self in the contemporary fragmented world. So, because of the alienation, because of the exclusion and the solitude of the human being, so identity crisis becomes a crucial theme, and the modern literature represents and questions the self in the contemporary world, and it also raises the concerns over the human identity. As modern society produces isolation, existential anxiety, psychological fragmentation, and the loss of meaning. So these are the perspectives which the literary authors produces produce in their concerned works. There are some theoretical perspectives also which are equally and closely associated with the identity crisis and alienation. And they are first existentialism, as Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus. They argue that individual must create meaning in an absurd world. As you must be aware that modern literature takes its precedence after the First World War, which ends in 1919. So the first and the foremost issue rises is the existentialism, the existential concern, and the meaning of the life. So various scholars, various philosophers, they come into being and they talk about the existential being, the existential concern, and they say that because due to the World War, the human were exploited, the human life was completely absurd and meaningless. So existential philosopher, they say that life is not absurd. We make it absurd, but we can make meaning, uh, significant meaning of life in this absurd world, and through the active participant, through the positive decisions, and through the active decision making and actions of life, we can make the life meaningful. Then the next concern is due to the World War, human psyche fragmented first. So there were some traumatic experiences, the traumatic effects on the human psyche, which gives the birth to the psychoanalytical criticism and the theory. And Sigmund Freud is the pioneer of the psychoanalytic criticism. And he introduces the idea of the unconscious conflict. So this unconscious conflict is the various desires the various desires inside the human psyche, inside the unconscious mind, and they are always in the conflict. So Sigmund Freud says that our desires, our meanings become unconscious. They reside in the unconscious mind, and they are always making a kind of conflict between our ego, superego, and it. So the next one is the Lacanian theory. Jacques Lacan discussed this, uh, discussed the mirror stage and the fragmented identity. And Jacques Lacan uh, just talks about the mirror stage, early stage of the human being during the childhood. A child goes through the mirror stage where he tries to understand himself in the fragmented world, where he tries to understand himself, but uh, his understanding or his identity remains the fragmented. And then next, modernism itself becomes a theoretical perspective which emphasizes the stream of consciousness technique and a subjective reality. Because of various issues, because of various social issues, human psyche affects first. So the stream of consciousness also symbolizes or represents the fragmented or uh, fragmented or broken human psyche. And then it talks about the subjective reality, that what we have been after the First World War. In the modern age, what is our identity? What is the human being? What is the human self? So these all issues and the concerns become prominent in the modern age. The next, we would see that how the Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger represents the modern issues. For example, the protagonist of Catcher in the Rye is Holden Caulfield, and he experiences alienation from the society. And his crisis reflects the existential angst and the post-war disillusionment. We can see this alienation from the society in the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock by T.S. Eliot, where Prufrock is alienated from the society, he's excluded, and he's sitting somewhere and thinking about his existence, his self, and he becomes quite alienated and indecisive of his married life, of his love life. So this is the existential angst which Prufrock even shows about him in the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock by T.S. Eliot, and Holden Caulfield experiences the same from the society. So as Holden Caulfield represents the modern individual struggling with the authenticity. So this becomes a staggering issue in the modern literature, that human being or individual struggles with the authenticity, with the idea of the self. There is another famous work, The Metamorphosis by Franz Kafka, and where we see that the protagonist is Gregor Samsa, who transforms himself into the giant insect. So his transformation symbolizes the Marxist alienation. And what the Marxist alienation is, that as per the Marxism, when human being transforms into something uh, else, like Gregor Samsa transforms into the giant insect, so his transformation is directly the alienation from his individuality, from his labor, from his humanity, from his family, and from themselves. So Kafka, through the Gregor Samsa, dramatizes this psychological and the social alienation. And when you go through this Gregor Samsa's um, story, then Gregor Samsa's narrative, you would see that he has been withdrawn from the society. He is completely alienated psychologically, socially, culturally from the family or from the society. The next famous theme is the gender and the feminism. As modern literature strongly questions the patriarchy and the gender roles, and we see that this gender and the feminism is directly discussed in the liberal feminism, which talks about the equal rights and the education. Radical feminism also, which talks about the patriarchy as the structural oppression. Then Marxist feminism, which talks about that all the economic roots the are the basis of the gender inequality. Then the French feminism, where Simone de Beauvoir argued that one is not born but becomes a woman, and how she becomes through culturally and socially. Then Judith Butler concept gender performativity, where it says that the gender is socially and culturally performed are the constructed. So we see that the gender and the feminism has bearing a strong existence in the modern literature, and different writers they talk about the feminist issues or the gender performativity or the gender um, parameters, and one of them is Virginia Woolf, who writes The Room of One's Own, and where she talks about the space for the women in the society, in the home. For example, she emphasizes uh, the material conditions like money and the space in the room of one's own, where she says that a woman must have the money and the room of one's own if she wants to write a fiction. And this idea aligns directly with the materialistic feminism. A literary work, The Handmaid's Tale, is also a famous one written by the Margaret Atwood in 1985. So in this work, you would see that there is a concept of radical feminism which critiques the patriarchy. There is a Foucault's theory of the surveillance which dominates and invades the privacy of the women. There is also the concept of biopolitics where the state controls over the bodies. And Margaret Atwood in this novel shows that how the Gilead society controls over the human body, how the women are exploited, how their body is treated as a commodity, how they are utilized, how their bodies are utilized as a machine, as a childbearing machine, and they give birth to the children of the capitalists or the socialists. Margaret Atwood, through this novel, criticizes the patriarchy and the capitalism, and she shows that how women body is a commodity, it's a kind of cyborg. Once it becomes useless, it becomes unfunctional, it becomes useless and discarded on the streets. Next, we have the race, colonialism, and the post-colonial identity. As modern literature addresses the colonial violence and the racial oppression. And there are various theories which talk about this colonial violence and the racial oppression, and they also talk about how the West represents or picturizes the East. Edward Said in 1978 writes The Orientalism, and this work is sometimes considered as the pioneer of the post-colonial theory. In this work, he gives the concept of Orientalism and the Occidentalism, and where Orientalism is for the Westerners, and how they consider themselves the superior, the educated, the enlightened, the rational being, and how the East, the Occident, is completely represented as something mysterious, something negative, something uneducated, something underprivileged. So, Edward Said, through this work, shows that how the West represents or constructs the East. And through this representation, they show the power, the hierarchy, the dynamics of the understanding, the experiences, and the discourse constructed for the Eastern countries, rather for the Eastern world. Homi Baba also gives the concept of the hybridity, the mimicry, and where it shows that all the Eastern countries deliberately want to become the West because they think themselves are they are structurally uh, shown as the inferior, something negative, something mysterious, and their conditions are vulnerable. So Eastern people, Eastern countries try to become the West. They try to mimic the Western society, the Western culture, and through this mimicry, they don't remain completely the Eastern, or they don't completely become the Western, but they are in between of the two different places, the spaces, which is the hybrid space, which is the hybrid identity as per the Homi Baba. Then Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak also talks about the in Ken the Subaltern speak talks about the subaltern identities, the Dalit identities, the untouchables, the underprivileged, the excluded social classes, and says that is there any representation of these all Dalit identities are the marginalized classes in our literature, in our society and the culture? And she says no. Why? Because they are completely and structurally dominated by the capitalist, by the colonialist, and their voices are suppressed always, and they don't speak for themselves. And even there is no representation, nobody speaks for them. And Gayatri Chakravarti also gives the example of that how the women in India, women in the Eastern countries are triply marginalized. And how they are triply marginalized? First, they are women. So being women itself becomes a cause of suppression. And then second, they have taken birth into the patriarchal society that how they are completely suppressed and dominated by the patriarchs, by the male social structure, the male dominant society. And third, they're also suppressed by the colonialists, the white people. So through these three layers of the suppression, three layers of the domination, the women become more vulnerable, the more suppressed in the Eastern countries, in the Eastern society. In the Beloved, for example, by Toni Morrison, we see that there is the historical trauma which is surpassed. For example, uh, in Beloved, the mother kills her daughter because she doesn't want her daughter to become the racially abused or become the slave. So due to this concern, one can say that mother kills the daughter in order to not continue the hereditary or the traditional or the collective, collective the trauma in the memories. So, in Eastern countries as well, we see that the mothers surpass their collective trauma to the daughters. So, this patriarchy itself is continuously ongoing. Nobody talks about it. Women are bearing the burden of the patriarchs, and a mother forwards or passes the burden of trauma, traditional trauma, to the daughter, then daughter to her daughter. So this way it becomes a kind of chain. So through this channelizing of the traumatizing experiences, women suffer more. So Toni Morrison in Beloved shows us this the traditional trauma and the channelization of the trauma, and she mother comes out voluntarily, breaks this chain, she kills her daughter, and she continuously struggles with her the traumatic experience. Next, there is the famous work, uh, The Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe, and it becomes another prominent example of the post-colonial racial theory. So, Things Fall Apart represents the colonial narrative, and it resists what Edward Said says that Western representation of the other. And in this work, we see that the colonials, the white, has the supremacy over the native of the Nigeria. So The Igbo community that is completely and structurally suppressed and dominated by the Westerners, by the white class. So Chinua Achebe criticizes that the colonial perspective and the representation of the Western representation of the Eastern as other. The next one prominent theme in the modern literature is the technology and dehumanization. As modern literature critiques the technological power and the surveillance, and Marxism also talks about the technology as it is a capitalistic control. And Foucault also talks about the technology in the panopticism, where he says that through the technology, we all are in the constant surveillance, like the cameras um, which are installed everywhere. So there is some invisible power which is seeing us everywhere, which is monitoring our action, which has eyes on us. Frankfurt School also, as the Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer, they are the representative of the Frankfurt School and a pioneer of the critical mass culture and industrial rationality. And they also talk about the technology and the dehumanization, and that how the technology rationalizes the subjectivity, and how this modern technological culture has the direct effect on the human identity, on the human psyche. Posthumanism also talks about the technological age, and it says that how the technology is aligning with the human identity, and how in the age of technology human identity becomes blurred, and the distinction between the human and the technology, human and machines, human and the animals uh, becomes less visible. In 1984, for example, written by George Orwell, we see that there is the concept of Big Brother. So Big Brother is a technological surveillance, the technological power, and Big Brother is a kind of panoptical power, who is invisible but yet um, omnipresent to everywhere. So Big Brother, when the characters say that Big Brother is watching us, it means that there is a hidden camera, there is a surveillance technology that is seeing us, that is monitoring us from everywhere. In Brave New World, for example, written by Aldous Huxley, we see that there is also the technology that creates the player-based control. So this player-based control is we can see in the modern day our food culture, where the Dominoes, where the pizzas, where various other things are continuously dominating us. They first capture our taste, they make us habitual, and then they control on us. So modern technology also says that, and modern theorists of the technology, they claim that modern food culture, modern living style, it is politically loaded, it is ideologically loaded. And Frankfurt School also criticizes this power concept, this power dynamic, and it also says that how the consumer society, the consumer culture is continuously it's continuously manipulated by the capitalist, by the corporates who have the power on the technology. Then the next one prominent issue in the modern literature is the environmental crisis, which we see under the study of eco-criticism, and the famous theorists like Vandana Shiva, etc., Lawrence Bell as well. So environmental crisis, uh, environmental crisis become a prominent theme in the modern literature, and in eco-criticism we see that how the literature and our contemporary environment is interrelated, it is relational to each other. And the deep ecology also studies that how the sea, the water, the river, the biodiversity has a direct connection with our identity, uh, with our living in the society. Then Anthropocene theory also talks about that how the emergence of the human being, or the evolution of the human being, has directly caused the devastation, the destruction of the nature, the environment. And Lawrence Bell environmental imagination talks about that how the human being uh, has not the separate agency, but environment has also its own agency. It has its own power. Earlier, only the human being was considered as the human being. It is relational, it is rational, it has the imagination, it has its own identity. But Lawrence Bell says that environment has also its own identity, its own imagination. So uh, Timothy Morton in the Hyper Project says that how the climate change is invisible, massive force. That how we human beings are directly molded, designed, and shaped by the contemporary environment. And for example, if somebody wears the coat, the jacket, the warm clothes, or the cotton clothes, so it is not the individual choice. We don't wear the warm clothes by ourselves. We wear the warm clothes due to the culture, due to the environment. So environment forces us to adapt that culture, to become this one or that one, or to what. And our even the eating culture is decided by our nature, our environment, our ecosystem. So if you are living in any cold place, so that cold place or environment forces you to wear the warm clothes. So wearing the warm clothes is not your own choice. It is the forced one. It is the deliberately given one by the environment, by the ecosystem. So through this way, Timothy Morton says that this is the hyper project, and the climate our climate, our ecosystem projects us to become this kind of identity or that kind of identity. For example, in The Road by Cormac Murthy, we see that the apocalyptic world reflects the ecological collapse and the fragility of the civilization. So says that human society is not individual or separate or isolated from the environment. It is directly connected or associated with our environment, and and it says that how the ecological collapse actually symbolizes the collapse of the society, the collapse of our civilization, the collapse of our identity. Then the next famous and prominent theme in the modern literature is mental health and psychological trauma. As uh, Kathy Kareth discusses the unrepresentable trauma. As earlier I discussed that how the after the First World War, the human psyche scattered, fragmented, broken, and how that trauma resided in our unconscious mind, and how we continuously dealing with these traumatic experiences. And this we study in the trauma theory, and then the Freudian psychoanalysis also study that how our desires, how our experiences, they reside in our unconscious mind, and then they conflict with our desire, with our conscious mind, with our ego and the superego. Then the stream of consciousness, a broken psyche, becomes a prominent theme in our modern literature. And the stream of consciousness is also a representation or the symbol of our broken psyche. For example, if you see any beggar or any mentally disabled person, or a mentally disabled person, mentally ill person, you would see that how that person continuously talks without any break, without any pause, and he connects something with one thing with something else. So this is a stream of consciousness. It means that speaking something irrationally, without breaking the thought, without taking the pause, without thinking consciously, and it becomes a prominent theme in the modern literature as well. For example, in Mrs. Dalloway, written by Virginia Woolf in 1928, I think, and there is a character whose name is Septimus Smith, and he represents the shell shock. He is shell shocked in the First World War, and we see that he has the stream of consciousness technique. His psyche is broken, his identity is broken and distorted. And Virginia Woolf, through the Septimus Smith, shows that how the interior monologue uh, works in the narrative technique, how the psychologically fragmented person behaves in the society. The next one prominent theme is the migration, globalization, and the cultural conflict. And in modern global mobility, we see that there are the hybrid identities, and these hybrid identities are represented in diasporic studies, where uh, if somebody voluntarily uh, or forcefully or deliberately migrates to any other country, so he becomes migrated and his identity is hybrid. He represents the two different cultures, the two different societies. One is his native or motherland, the second one is newly resided and newly adapted place. Then we have the hybridity which is given by Homi Baba, and it says that how voluntarily we want to become, or forcefully we want to become the Westerners, the like the white people, and when we deliberately want to choose the different culture, the different society, the different living standards represented by Western societies, then we are a hybrid. We don't completely remain the our natives are at the first place, or we don't even adapt or become the newly adapted place, or the new culture, or the new uh, social standard, or the living style. But we represent the both are two different cultures, the two different identities. One is our native, and other is the newly adapted one. And in the globalization theory, we also see that how we are not separate or isolated, but we are globalized. Globalized is, or we are globalized and localized as well. Pierre Bourdieu and Jean Baudrillard, they talk about the globalization, that how we are not locals, but we are the globally represented in the age of the science and technology, or in the age of the globalization. In the cultural materialism, for example, we also see that how we are culturally globalized, and materialistically we are everywhere. For example, if we use the social media, if we use the social media or any other social platform, so our identity becomes the global. We are culturally spreaded everywhere. We are not at one place, but we are everywhere at the same time. So, for example, in the namesake by Jhumpa Lahiri, we see that there is a character Gogol who embodies the diasporic identity crisis and the cultural hybridity. So, what is diasporic identity crisis? When you migrate to any different country, to any different culture and the society, you represent the two different culture, the two different societies. So, you are you are suffering the in between the place, and you then represent the fragmented self, fragmented identity, where not you are completely eastern, where you are not completely western. So you become the in the in between space, the in between place. And there is the identity crisis. There becomes the identity crisis. Your identity is not stable, but it becomes unstable, it becomes fluid and the flux. And this is the cultural hybridity as well, that we represent the two different cultures. The next prominent theme in the modern literature is the power, politics, and the totalitarianism. As Marxism talks about the ideology and the class struggle, and he says that how economic situations, the capitalism creates the ideology, the class struggle, the discrimination in the society. Michel Foucault also talks about that those who are in the power, they embody the knowledge, they possess the knowledge, and they set the discourse in the society. For example, the knowledge is power is a concept propounded by the Michel Foucault, where he says that uh, that all those people who have the knowledge, they are the representative of the power, and all those who are people who are in the power, they represent the discourse. They set the discourse. For example, a psychiatrist set the discourse of the psychiatry, or a teacher, or the religious leaders set the discourse of the religious doctrines or religious ideologies. So even Louis Althusser talks about the ideological state apparatus, where he says that there are two different ideological apparatus, so two different state apparatuses. One is the ideological, and other is the suppressive or oppressive state apparatus. So ideological state apparatus or ideological discourse is set by the religious leaders, the political leaders, the teachers, the family members, the social, the um, socially dominant classes. Whereas the suppressive or oppressive ideological apparatus is set by the state, the government, uh, the hospital, and the police stations, and so on. Uh, Antonio Gramsci also talks about the cultural hegemony, that how through the cohesion and the consent, we keep our hegemony culturally in the society, or how the dominant classes, the capitalists, are, are the patriarchs. They keep their domination, to keep their ideology uh, uh, continues in the society through the cohesion and the consent. For example, in Animal Farm by George Orwell, we see that this novella critiques the revolution and ideological corruption through allegory. And even in 1984, we see that totalitarian state, how the totalitarian regime suppresses the people and keeps the hegemony, the power structure, the political power uh, continue through the coercion and the consent. So, to conclude this, the modern literature is deeply interconnected with the existential concern, then the Marxist concern of the classless society or the class struggles, then the feminism, feminist issues like inequality, the gender parameters, the gender performativity, then the post-colonial concerns like the hybridity, like the suppression, like the Occident and the Orientalism, then the psychoanalysis, the unconscious conflicts, and the desires, the ego and superego, then the eco-criticism, the ecological concerns, the ecological imagination, the ecological agency and the power, then the cultural studies, the cultural materialism, the cultural hegemony. So these all theoretical ideas, even they reflect on the modern crisis of the identity, gender, race, technology, environment, mental health, and the power politics are the power nexus in the society. So through this way, we can say that the modern literature becomes a space where the storytelling emerge with the contemporary social issues, and the contemporary literature or the modern literature does not just entertain, but it interrogates the ideology, it interrogates and deconstructs the power structure, it challenges the social system, the patriarchy and the capitalism, and it transforms our consciousness. And modern literature is paying a way for the uh, postmodernism or the post-humanism or the post-colonialism, and which we would see in any other video. So I hope that you enjoyed this lecture, and hoping to meet you in the next video with another fascinating topic.